And he is currently in the throes of PhD work and research at Utah State University. Zach and his wife Krista live in South Jordan, Utah, and are currently seeking advanced degrees in the school of parenting with emphasis in Lego construction and design, tantrumology, and zero energy yet still parenting theory.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Boy, I just wouldn't be honest if I didn't say I wasn't nervous beyond all ends to be here. I'm excited to be here, but I'm really nervous to be here. On my way over, I was thinking, boy, there's so much rain. She mentioned rain delay, and I thought, don't they usually cancel things for this much rain? But I guess we're glad that they didn't. I'm Zach. Quinn and I taught together a couple of years ago, and he's the smart one. I'm just the one that covers up his lack of smartness by funny jokes about the family. So, but we decided instead of tag teaming the presentation that I would present the paper. But just know as I do this was a complete joint effort, and I couldn't have done it without him. I also couldn't have done it without my wife, as I mentioned in my bio. I learned a lot of lessons in doing a master's degree, and I'm learning a lot more lessons in doing a doctoral degree. And one of the lessons I learned, of course, is how much time advanced study takes and how much effort it takes. I also learned that when you get a master's degree, contrary to what I thought as a kid, you don't actually become a master in anything that impressive. So when I set out and wanted to choose a thesis topic, I thought, well, I'd really like to be a master of church business, church finance, church income. And my advisor said, it's too big of a topic, you can't become a master in that. I said, okay, well, how about tithing then? And tithing, that's something I'd like to be a master in. I said, it's still too big of a topic. I said, okay, how about tithing in the 19th century, 20th century church history? Still too big. How about Lorenzo Snow's emphasis of tithing in the 20th century? Still too big. How about Lorenzo Snow's emphasis of tithing in 1899? Nope, still too big. How about Lorenzo Snow's emphasis of tithing in 1899 as it pertains to his trips to St. George in southern Utah and back in the Salt Lake Valley? Okay, you can be master in that. So don't be fooled by titles, I guess. But I'm really excited about this topic. A couple of years ago, my wife and I, one of her friends, someone I've got to know, their daughter passed away very suddenly, very surprisingly. And it hurt them, of course, but it was something that affected this entire group of friends to have someone that was so young pass away so unexpectedly. And having children of my own that age, you can't help but empathize with the parents and the family. Since then, of course, death, like it has for many, maybe all of you, has touched my family. The occurrence of death, the threat of death. Just a month ago, we learned that some of our neighbors down the street, they have two twin 4-year-olds. And one of the twins was diagnosed with cancer and is undergoing chemotherapy right now. And it's scary for the family. And it's scary for the community. So as I think about the topic, I guess the emphasis or the thought behind the topic is, what is the gospel, what is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ offer those kinds of situations, offer those families? And we come at it from kind of a different perspective. So the title of the presentation, Life After Death, Joseph Smith's Funeral Sermons. Magic clicker. To understand kind of the background of what Joseph Smith did, and we'll explain a little bit of what his funeral sermons were. But first, to understand kind of the background, you have to understand what the contemporary view of death was in America in the early to mid-1800s. So just a couple of sketches from some historians. This is Samuel Brown, who wrote just a fantastic book, In Heaven as It Is on Earth. Joseph Smith, the early Mormon conquest of death. I can't read that, I guess I'm going to read this. But he mentions this. He mentions this conflict of death. And if you read the middle of the quote there, he says, this conflict left participants deeply troubled and conflicted. This culture, meaning the Protestant culture in the view of death that was currently available, most loudly and frequently, exclaimed most loudly and frequently, what it feared most was not true. that Christianity could protect their identity and community against the specter of death. There was this sort of uneasy fear about what death was. I love this little poem to kind of illustrate the feeling of the time. Through sorrow's might and danger's path, amid the deepening gloom, we soldiers of a heavenly king are marching to the tomb. To kind of illustrate their feelings towards death. A slight optimism, but more than anything else, just a resignation to the unknown. Of course, this hits not just Americans, but it hit Joseph Smith's family as well. Joseph, of course, at an early age, lost his brother Alvin, which he says he remembered with pains that almost broke his heart. Lucy, I think I put this in here. His mother Lucy said this about that moment. Thus was our happiness blasted in a moment when we least expected the blow. It came upon us, the poisoned shaft entered our very hearts and core and diffused its deadly effect throughout our veins. We were at a time almost swallowed up in grief so much that it seemed impossible for us to interest ourselves at all about the concerns of life. The feeling of every heart was to make speedy preparation to follow him who had been too much the idol of our heart. And he was the idol, especially for Joseph. And then if it pleased God to take us also, we would receive the call as a favor at his hands from whom it came. So Joseph loses Alvin. Of course, we also know that Joseph lost 6 of 11 children, Joseph and Emma did, before they reached the age of maturity. And then Joseph loses his father before he himself is taken. So death is something that's extremely relevant to the prophet Joseph Smith, something that he's very intimately aware of. And something that the saints were aware of too in Nauvoo. In 1840, the death rate in Nauvoo for that year was 64 deaths. In 1844, there were over 400 deaths. Now, of course, the population grew in that time, but if you account for the population, the death rate still doubled in 4 years. And so, not just is this something that Joseph's aware of, this is something that the members of the church, the saints of the church, are extremely intimately aware of. And the problem is that contemporary religion at the time offered them very little answer. Eliza Snow wrote this poem, and I like it because, and I even organized it left and right, so that you can see kind of her response to contemporary Christian answers to death on the left side, and then what the restored gospel offers on the right side. She says, Where art thou, death? I've seen thy visage, and have heard thy sound, and the deep low murmuring sound that rises on my tread. Thy land is called a land of shadows, and thy path a path of blind contingence, gloominess, and fear. And then on the right side, but thou art changed. The terror of thy looks, the darkness that encompassed thee is gone. There is no frightfulness about thee now. Intelligence, the everlasting lamp of truth eternal, lighted from the world on high, has poured its brilliant flame abroad to scatter darkness and to chase the horrors that attended thy approach. And thou art changed, for since the glorious light of revelation shone upon thy path, thou seemst no more a hideous monster. And so what we want to explore today is, how did we get from here to there? One historian put it this way: it seems clear then that from the early 1830s until just months before the prophet's murder in 1844, the eschatology of Mormonism, that means Mormonism's idea of death and preaching about death, continuously expanded from the rudimentary Christian belief in an individual reward for the righteous to a complex, highly structured, immortal existence. And so what we want to do is explore that through looking at Joseph Smith's funeral sermons. Donald Cannon is who turned me onto this in the first place. He wrote this article just chronologically accounting for Joseph's 11 funeral sermons that we put. I've added one here to this presentation. We're very familiar with the King Follett Discourse, which was in fact a funeral sermon. What we're often not aware of is that there were actually 2 King Follett sermons. The day after King Follett passed away, Joseph preached a funeral sermon that we often don't refer to. And then a month later, to the rest of the family, he preached a second, now the more famous King Follett sermon. But the King Follett sermon is a funeral sermon among many others that Joseph preached, or at least that he preached that we have excellent accounts for. And what I've tried to do is to pull from these funeral sermons some doctrinal themes, to kind of look at it as if we knew nothing about the afterlife, And if all we had to look at was Joseph Smith's funeral sermons. So along my lines of being a master of nothing, I realized that in order to be confident in something, you have to narrow the scope so tinily that no one can argue with you. So we're not talking about what Joseph knew about death. We're not talking about what modern prophets have taught about death. We're not talking about the individuals involved in the accounts. What we're talking about is what can we know about death or the afterlife just from what Joseph preached in funeral sermons, and just from what we have available of what he preached in funeral sermons. And so you can sense here this quote that is somewhat familiar, that Joseph was passionate about what he knew, almost this unbounding sense of wonder and awe at the revelations that had been poured into his mind, in which he felt a duty to preach to those who would listen. Had I inspiration, revelation, and lungs to communicate what my soul has contemplated in times past, there is not a soul in this congregation but would go to their homes and shut their mouths in everlasting silence on religion until they have learned something. I like this quote because in the King Follow sermon, the second one that Joseph gave, he actually spoke for 2 hours. And he spoke for so long that he hurt his lungs. And so the next day, he had planned to speak again. He actually had Brigham Young stand up and speak on his behalf because he actually had hurt his lungs in talking about what was so passionate and so important to him. For the audience's part, they were just as touched and just as moved by what he said. This is Joseph Fielding. Joseph's discourse on the origin of man, the nature of God, and the resurrection was the most interesting matter of this time, meaning this time in church history. I have never felt more delighted with his discourse than at this time. They said in his oration, it is the voice of God, not of man. And so if we can approach these funeral sermons with that sense of respect and awe, then let's dive into some of the topics. The first one is this, and it might seem like an obvious one, but Joseph Smith had an unbounding confidence in life after death. And that was important for members of the church to hear from their prophet, who was the mouthpiece of God's revelation. We're well aware of this teaching in the scriptures. At the funeral sermon for Elias Higby was a judge, a county judge, and a church recorder. He said this, Joseph said this, "Where has Judge Higby gone?" Paused and then added this answer, "Who is there that would not give all his goods to feed the poor and pour out his gold and silver to the four winds to go where Judge Higby is gone?" In other words, this isn't just a confidence in the afterlife. This is confidence in an afterlife so glorious that we would do anything to get there. He further crystallizes this. This is at the funeral of James Adams. James Adams was actually an early political opponent of Abraham Lincoln. He was a lawyer and somewhat of a father figure to the prophet Joseph Smith. And so at his funeral, Joseph says this about the afterlife. "The organization of the spiritual and heavenly world and of spiritual and heavenly beings is agreeable to the most perfect order and harmony." A little bit later on, he mentions that these spirits, if we were to see them, would be enveloped in flaming fire. They are not far from us, and no one understands our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and are often pained together with it. That's one of the scary quotes I have in the presentation. But to contemplate that, of how close we are, and you get the sense as you read Joseph's sermons that he was very familiar with how close this afterlife was. It's not something that's distant. It's not something that's separate. It's something that's present. It's something that's pressing, as if the world between the living and the world between the dead really was separated by the thinnest of veils. At the King Follett sermon, the second one, the one we're more famous, or the one we're more familiar with, King Follett passed away. He was working in a well and he was crushed by rocks. And so Joseph, this is the second sermon that he preached. And he says this to the congregation: "You who mourn the loss of friends are only separated for a small moment from their spirits, and their spirits are only separated from their bodies for a short season." And then at the end, "Does this not give you satisfaction?" And so Joseph was aware of how close the spirit world was, and he also wanted this presence, this pressing proximity of the spirit world to be something that offered comfort. He wanted this to be something that people could rejoice in, something people could be happy with. However, it doesn't end there, of course. In fact, he was very, very often quick to jump from spirit world to resurrection. It's very difficult to separate the two in his discourses because he taught them almost simultaneously. And so the second major topic that we pull out of the sermons is that of the resurrection. I put the scripture up here. It's one we're familiar with. 1 Corinthians 15 is all about resurrection, life after death. It's where we get the doctrine of celestial, terrestrial, and telestial beings in the resurrection. But it was also one that Joseph had read, the entire section, the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians, Joseph had read at many, in fact, even the majority of the funeral sermons. When he had Brigham Young stand up that next day, he had Brigham Young stand up and read 1 Corinthians 15. At a couple of the sermons, that's all that he did. He'd have someone read 1 Corinthians 15, or he would have them read it in preamble to what he would say later. He taught this all over. There were really a lot of places where he taught resurrection. There, I failed to mention, of the 12 funeral sermons that Joseph has, many of the early ones we just don't have information on, besides some eyewitnesses' brief recounting of what happened. So funeral sermons, for example, for Polly Knight, or for James Marsh, some of those ones we don't have the text of what Joseph said. We just have the text of what the audience wrote in their journals as they went home. But a lot of what they wrote was that Joseph preached the teaching of the doctrine of resurrection. He really clarifies this, though, at the funeral sermon for Lorenzo Barnes. Lorenzo Barnes, sorry, let me take a drink. Lorenzo Barnes had been serving a mission in England, and he passed away while on his mission in England. And it's kind of interesting because in the sermon, Joseph almost regrets the fact that Brother Barnes couldn't have been brought home and buried in American soil. And one of the more interesting doctrines I ran into as I looked at these, there's something good and sacred to me in this thing. The place where a man is buried is sacred. When I heard of the death of our beloved Brother Barnes, it would not have affected me so much if I had the opportunity of burying him in the land of Zion. I believe those who have buried their friends here, their condition is enviable. And he doesn't fully explain this. You get the sense all over in his funeral sermons that Joseph knows a lot more than what it is that he's explaining. I'm sure you could probably use that as a lens to see the entire restoration of the minuscule amount of what Joseph said compared to what it was that Joseph knew. And this is one of those senses that he knew more than what he was telling. But at the very least, he starts to explain a little bit of what he calls in this sermon the doctrine of resurrection. He says this: "It is a privilege to have our dead buried on the land where God has appointed to gather his saints together, and where they will be none but saints, where they may have the privilege of laying their bodies where the Son of Man will make his appearance, and where they may hear the sound of the trump that shall call them forth to behold him, that in the morn of the resurrection they may come forth in a body, and come out of their graves, and strike hands immediately in eternal glory and felicity, rather than be scattered thousands of miles apart." Now that phrase in there, strike hands, he mentions a couple times in the sermon, and it hints at what Joseph would talk about as not just the doctrine of resurrection, but almost the ordinance of resurrection. That resurrection had an order to it, and it was done by ordinance. He mentions this in the sermon, this vision that he sees, where he says, "I actually saw men before they had ascended from the tomb, as though they were getting up slowly. They took each other by the hand and said to each other, 'My father, my son, my mother, my daughter, my brother, my sister.'" Elsewhere he mentions that he hopes that one day his father can be resurrected, and then through that ordinance resurrect him, through that clasping of hands. And so there's more to resurrection than sometimes what we think. We're well familiar with this couplet written by Lorenzo Snow, but when he writes it, he says his influence of the doctrine is from Joseph. "As man now is, God once was; as God now is, man will be." And we're familiar with this. This is, of course, one of the hallmark teachings of Joseph's funeral sermonizing. He teaches first the idea that resurrection without knowledge of salvation and without ordinances of salvation is, as he puts it here, disappointing. In fact, the very last sentence there, "would not this," meaning to be resurrected without a knowledge of salvation and the ordinances to achieve salvation, "would not this be a greater disappointment, a more painful thought than annihilation?" In other words, to be resurrected, but to be resurrected without any hope of salvation, exaltation, future family, future glory, and a life with and like God. And so to solve that problem, Joseph teaches this. If men would acquire salvation, they have got to be subject, before they leave this world, to certain rules and principles which were fixed by an unalterable decree before the world was. At the King Follett sermon, of course, this is where Joseph really kind of clarifies this doctrine, this redefinition of salvation that we're familiar with and that we know and love him for. He says this, "Here then," I should mention this in preamble, one of the authors, a historian, has written that at this occasion, this King Follett sermon, there's never been a more ample time for Joseph to avoid confrontational doctrine. Many of the sermons he taught spontaneously, meaning he had very little time to prepare. This one, however, he had time to prepare, he had ample time to prepare. And yet this happens to be the sermon where Joseph unleashes the doctrinal guns, as it were, and just kind of lets loose and teaches as much as he possibly can about what he sees and what he knows. So he redefines eternal life. Here then is eternal life, to know the only wise and true God. You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves, to be kings and priests to God, the same as all gods have done, by going from a small degree to another, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, to inherit the same glory, the same power, the same exaltation, until you ascend to the throne of eternal power, the same as those who are gone before. In short, salvation means we become like God. We live with him and we become like him. He continues. I want you to understand God and how he comes to be God. We suppose that God was God from eternity. I will refute that idea, or I will do away or take away the veil so you may see. It is the first principle to know that we may converse with him, and that he once was man like us, and the Father was once on earth like this. You could almost phrase the plan of salvation, the entire plan of salvation, in these two quotes. First, this one we just read. God recognizes his progression and his situation and the power and glory that is his, and then, as Joseph says, finds himself in the midst of spirits and glory because he was greater and because he saw proper to institute laws whereby the rest could have a privilege to advance like himself, that they might have one glory upon another in all that knowledge, power, and glory in order to save the world of spirits. If you were to summarize, I do this with students quite often to ask them what the plan of salvation is. And usually without fail, a student will say, I can do it, and they'll come to the board and they'll draw a circle to pre-mortal life and an arrow drawing to mortal life, and they'll draw the mortal life, and there's a grave here, and then we separate, and there's a spirit world, the spirit paradise, the spirit prison, they'll draw the veil there, and then there's three kingdoms, the sun, the moon, the stars. And I tell them, if you draw that to someone, the non-member of the church comes up to you and says, what's the plan of salvation? And you draw a bunch of circles and lines and squigglies, they're going to think you're nuts. Plus, that's not even the question. When they ask you what's the plan of salvation, what they're asking you is, what's God's plan for helping us fulfill our destiny? It's the greatest question man has. What's the purpose of life? And so when your friends ask you what's the plan of salvation, you don't draw circles and lines. You tell them the plan of salvation is God's plan for helping us return to live with him and become like him. That's the plan of salvation. And he does it through the divine mission and life and death and atonement of his son, Jesus Christ. Joseph understood that. Joseph taught it. In fact, he taught it so confidently that he could, in multiple funeral sermons, he could even assign salvation, assure salvation to funeral participants, to those who passed away. He teaches, of course, that sealing can tie a father and a mother. It secures their posterity so they cannot be lost. It will be saved by virtue of the covenant of their father and mother. And you have to think as you read this that Joseph is thinking not just of those that passed away, but his own family, and the power that sealing provides to link families together. The first thing you do, as he says in the first King Follett sermon, you go and seal on earth your sons and your daughters unto yourself, and yourself unto your fathers in eternal glory. I will walk through the gate of heaven and claim what I seal, and those that follow me and my counsel. And he was so confident in this that in a couple of funeral sermons he would assign people their sealing their salvation on the spot. So just a couple of examples. At the funeral of Elias Higby, Willard Richards records that Joseph spoke of the blessings which Elias Higby would obtain in the afterlife. He talks about the blessings that Elias Higby would obtain in the afterlife. The funeral of James Adams, Joseph says, Patriarch Adams is now one of the spirits of the just men made perfect, which of course is a scriptural phrase for those who achieve salvation from 1776. and if revealed now, must be revealed in fire, and the glory could not be endured. At the King followed sermon, you mourners who have occasion to rejoice, for your husband is gone to wait until the resurrection. I am authorized to say, by the authority of the Holy Ghost, that you have no occasion to fear, for he is gone to the home of the just. And so to be so confident in that afterlife that he could even look at someone and tell them where they were going. This applied not just to adults, of course, but it applied especially, and maybe most pointedly to the innocent, to the young. James Marsh is the son of Thomas Marsh. He passes away when he's 14, and we don't have the account of what Joseph said at his funeral sermon. But we do have this interesting article. Joseph was the editor of a journal in Nauvoo called the Elders' Journal. And the obituary of James Marsh tells this interesting story. When James was but 9 years of age, he had a remarkable vision in which he talked with the Father, capital Father, and many of the ancient prophets face to face, and beheld the Son of God coming in his glory. He said that the Lord showed him his own name written in the book of life, in the mansions of celestial glory, and he saw his own mansion there. Then later, when his father saw that he prayed to the Lord to take him, he said, "My son, are you confident that if you die now, your spirit will rest in the celestial paradise?" James answered, "Yes, sir." Then said his father, "My son, go in peace, and expect to come forth at the resurrection of the just, where you and I will again strike hands." He again answered, "Yes, sir, I will." And immediately he fell asleep without a struggle or a groan. Marion Lyon, daughter of Windsor Lyon, passed away when she was 4 years old. And at her sermon, Joseph did say this: "The Lord takes away many, even in infancy, that they may escape the envy of man, and the sorrows and the evils of this present world. They were too pure, too lovely, to live on earth. Therefore, if rightly considered, instead of mourning, we have reason to rejoice, as they are delivered from evil, and we shall soon have them." It's just beautiful. The doctrine of baptizing children, of sprinkling them, where they must welter in hell, is a doctrine not true, not supported in Holy Writ, and is not consistent with the character of God. All children are redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ, and the moment the children leave this world, they are taken to the bosom of God. This salvation applied, of course, not just to adults, to children living, those that have passed on, but of course to those that have passed on previous. We know that one of the things that bothered Joseph most about the passing of his brother Alvin was this. His brother William wrote that at Alvin's funeral, that the reverend preached that Alvin's soul, William's words were, he implied strongly that Alvin's soul had gone to hell, and that troubled the prophet. And so when the revelation came that we had salvation for the dead, that there was a way to reach into the grave and to save those who had passed away, was glorious to him and glorious to those who heard it. This account, this is the Seymour Brunson funeral. And Joseph, although he taught this in multiple places and multiple venues, he said the first time he mentioned baptism for the dead, the funeral salvation, or the doctrine of salvation for the dead, was at the funeral of Seymour Brunson. And it's interesting, it's kind of interesting to piece together how the story happened as you look at the records. Simon Baker, who was there, recorded, Joseph taught that people could now act for their friends who had departed this life, and that the plan of salvation was calculated to save all who were willing to obey the requirements of the law of God. So once he teaches that, the people there at the sermon rush down to the river and start baptizing people for the dead. Jane Nyman, after Joseph's sermon, she then went and was baptized for her son Cyrus Livingston Nyman by Harvey Olmsted. A passerby rushes into the river to see what's going on. Eventually there comes further revelation to Joseph that there needs to be an order, there needs to be a recorder for this to happen, and it needs to happen in the temple. And so when the Nauvoo temple was completed in 1841, of course, that's when the work for the dead continues. But just this enthusiasm for doctrine, just that permeated whatever they did. Heber Kimball, forgive the spelling, this is his, not mine, but mine's not much better, writes this. His wife is there at the sermon, and so he writes this letter. Seymour Brunson is gone, David Patton came after him. The room was full of angels that came after him to waft him home. He was buried under arms. The procession that went to the grave was judged to be 1 mile long, and a more joyful season, she, his wife, says she never saw before, on account of the glory that Joseph set forth. That glory that he set forth is that doctrine of salvation. the spirit of Elijah is that we would redeem our dead and connect ourselves with our fathers, which are the greatest responsibility in this world that God has laid upon us is to seek after God. All of those phrases that we know and love come from this. There's more. There's tons and tons more. But I think we can draw a couple of conclusions, a couple of implications from what we see and from what we read there. The first is this: don't neglect this glorious and beautiful afterlife and resurrection that Joseph teaches. If you know Lorenzo Barnes, he says this: I am glad I have the privilege of communicating to you some things which, if grasped closely, will be a help to you when earthquakes bellow, the clouds gather, the lightnings flash, and the storms are ready to burst upon you like peals of thunder. Lay hold on these things, and let not your knees tremble, nor your hearts faint. What can earthquakes, wars, tornadoes do? Nothing. All your losses will be made up to you in the resurrection, provided you continue faithful by the vision of the Almighty I have seen. I think sometimes we jump out of excitement to the celestial kingdom, and it is wonderful and glorious. But let's not forget that immediately upon leaving this life, there is a glorious afterlife that Joseph taught. And at the conclusion of that spirit afterlife, there is a glorious resurrection and a glorious millennium. And so as wonderful and incredibly and ununderstandably wonderful as the celestial kingdom is, let's not forget that God doesn't just provide us an end result of glory. He provides us a glorious passage to that end result. The second is this: don't be afraid of God's mercy and generosity. This, of course, is from Elder Holland, and you'll know this, the quote, because we loved it when he said it. Surely the thing God enjoys most about being God is the thrill of being merciful, especially those who don't expect it and often feel they don't deserve it. Of all the things I found in the funeral sermons, one thing I didn't find was any evidence of Joseph making checklists for salvation. There's nowhere in the funeral sermons where he says, well, in order to receive the celestial kingdom, you need this, and this. This person had these three qualifications and not this one, therefore they're terrestrial kingdom material. He doesn't say that. You get the sense from Joseph that salvation is generous and loving and comes from a generous and loving and merciful God. I remember growing up, my contact with the church was limited as a youth. We went to church very, very rarely. And it was seminary that actually kind of brought me back to church. Seminary and some really good peer pressure. But I remember sitting in my seminary class and looking at the plan of salvation, looking at the celestial kingdom and thinking, okay, celestial kingdom's for the best. I get that. So the seminary council president and the prophet of the church go to the celestial kingdom. Terrestrial kingdom is for the better, and celestial kingdom is for the okay. And I must be somewhere between the okay and the better. And I remember thinking, I don't think that's what Joseph thought. I think Joseph saw salvation as something that came from a loving, merciful, and generous God. So let's be careful not to limit how loving and merciful and generous he is. The last is this. This may be the best message we have to share. This final quote: let those truths sink down in our hearts, that we may even here begin to enjoy that which shall be in full hereafter. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna to Almighty God, that rays of light begin to burst forth upon us even now. I cannot find words to express myself. When we talk to people about the church, let's talk to them about this glorious doctrine of the afterlife, of the resurrection, of salvation in the celestial kingdom for the innocent, for the dead, for ourselves, for our family. Let's talk about this so that what Joseph preached can stay with us. I bear my testimony that these doctrines are true. They make a difference. They've made a difference to me. At the funeral sermon of his father, this isn't Joseph Smith, this is Robert Lee Thompson who preaches the funeral. The man whom he had been accustomed to look upon as a patriarch, a father and a counselor, is no more an inhabitant of mortality. He has dropped his plate and bid adieu to terrestrial scenes, and his spirit now free and unencumbered roams and expatiates that world where the spirits have just been made perfect well, and where pain, sickness, tribulation, and death are. That's my testimony. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Amen.